Sarah White, a gifted photographer, vanished without a trace during a routine hike. Her camera's last photo, a blurred silhouette, is the only clue. Was it a random disappearance, or had something darker been stalking her? As secrets unravel, the truth becomes far more chilling than anyone could have imagined. What happened to Sarah? The answer lies hidden in her final moments. The scene that met the first responders was unsettling, but not entirely abnormal. Sarah's bag was found by the side of the trail. Her camera, the prized possession she had carried for years, was still attached to her backpack. Everything seemed untouched, like she had simply disappeared in the blink of an eye. No struggle, no sign of distress, just an empty trail. But then, they found something else. Her camera had taken one final picture before it was left behind. A single photograph, blurred, distorted. It wasn't the peaceful landscape she had been photographing, the image was unsettling. And it was the only clue that remained. What could it mean? As the news of her disappearance spread, the questions only grew. People who had known Sarah for years couldn't fathom what had happened. Was it an accident? Had she gotten lost? Or was something darker at play? There was no indication of any personal issues in Sarah's life, no threats, no enemies. So why, then, would she just vanish? The authorities had little to go on. The investigation began with the usual steps. They canvassed the area where Sarah was last seen. The search parties grew in size, including volunteers who were just as determined to bring Sarah back as her family was. Yet, with each passing hour, the sense of hope dwindled. No one knew where she had gone, or worse, if she was still alive. But that photograph, it was something that no one could ignore. That blurry figure, the one just beyond the edge of focus, was not Sarah. Who was it? And why had her camera captured that moment? Sarah's disappearance became a puzzle, one that seemed impossible to solve. The small town where she had lived for most of her life was shaken by the events. People gathered, searched, and prayed for answers. But the more they uncovered, the fewer answers they found. Her family, desperate for closure, had to come to terms with the fact that whatever happened to Sarah, it had happened quickly. It was as if someone had taken her in the blink of an eye, with no warning and no trace. The photograph was the only thing that didn't belong. It was the anomaly. As the investigation progressed, the authorities started questioning everything. Had Sarah been alone when she took the photograph? Or had someone else been with her? The further they dug, the more questions arose. Was it possible that someone had been watching her? And if so, who? By the end of the day, the searchers were exhausted. And the reality began to settle in. This wouldn't be a quick resolution. As night fell over the trail Sarah had walked, a sense of unease lingered. Whatever had happened to Sarah White was something no one could have anticipated. She had left behind a trail of clues, but each one seemed to lead to another dead end. Her disappearance was beginning to look less like an accident and more like a carefully planned mystery, one that no one could solve. But the photograph, it still haunted them. Every time they looked at it, they saw something different. A shift in perspective, a flicker of movement. Was it the wind, or was it something else, someone else? The blurred silhouette had become a symbol of everything they couldn't understand. And Sarah's family, her friends, began to wonder if they'd ever see her again. The photograph was more than just a blurry image. It was the only thread they had to hold onto in the midst of a growing storm of unanswered questions. Whoever had taken Sarah, whatever had happened, was still out there, and they were just beginning to realize that Sarah's disappearance was the first chapter in a much darker story. And the investigation, it was just beginning. It was a day that started like any other for Sarah White. The sky was overcast, the kind of weather that made the world feel quieter, more introspective. Sarah was used to these kinds of days. She had always found solace in nature. in the stillness that a solitary walk through the woods could bring. A few close friends knew this about her, that sometimes she needed to be alone to recharge, to capture the world as she saw it through the lens of her camera. On that day, Sarah had left her house with a clear plan. A short hike through the nearby woods, to take some pictures of the early autumn scenery. Her favorite subjects were landscapes. Nature untouched by the hustle of modern life. She was an amateur photographer, but the way she framed her shots, the way she caught the light, made it clear that photography was her passion. She walked out the door with nothing more than her camera, her gear, and her sense of peace, ready to immerse herself in the quiet. It was a typical trail, one she had walked many times before. There was nothing unusual about it. The trailhead was marked with a simple wooden sign, leading into the dense trees where the faint smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. The path was well worn, easy to follow, and on a normal day, Sarah would have spent hours exploring, finding new angles for her photos. But this time, things were different. Sarah was never seen again after she left the trailhead. At first, her family didn't worry. She had done this before, taking off on her own for hours at a time without telling anyone. But by late afternoon, when she hadn't returned home, they began calling her phone. No answer. Concern started to grow. By nightfall, Sarah's family called the authorities. The first responders arrived, and a search was organized quickly. The day had already turned into night, and the forest was beginning to feel more intimidating than peaceful. The search parties scoured the area where Sarah was last seen, starting from the trailhead and working outward. Volunteers joined in, armed with flashlights and a growing sense of urgency. But as they combed through the woods, they found nothing, no sign of her. It was as if she had evaporated into thin air. The only thing they discovered was Sarah's backpack, lying open and abandoned along the trail. Inside, they found her camera, still attached to its strap, as though she had planned to take another shot. The rest of her belongings were in order: her water bottle, her notebook, even her jacket. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. The area had been searched thoroughly, and yet there were no signs of a struggle. No broken branches, no footprints leading away from the trail, not even the faintest trace of her. It was eerie. How could someone simply vanish without a trace in such an open, well-trafficked area? There were no theories, just questions. Did she leave on her own? Was she lost, perhaps injured? Had something else happened? The authorities were quick to start their investigation. They spoke to locals, hoping to uncover any sightings of Sarah that might give them a lead. But as the days passed, no one could provide any helpful information. She hadn't been seen by anyone other than the search teams. Her phone was off, and her camera revealed nothing that could shed light on her whereabouts. The picture it had taken just before she disappeared was the last known clue, blurry and distorted, showing a shadowy figure that no one could identify. As the days turned into weeks, the situation grew more confusing. No one could explain how Sarah had disappeared. She had left no sign of distress. The forest, while vast, was not so dense that it would swallow a person whole. Yet there was no trace of her, no tracks to follow, and no hints of foul play. No one could make sense of it. Her disappearance felt unnatural, like something had whisked her away, in a way no one could understand. The media began to take notice of the case. The story spread, drawing the attention of the public. Sarah White, a local photographer, was now the subject of widespread speculation. Some believed she had simply become lost, her sense of direction compromised in the unfamiliar terrain. Others wondered if she had been abducted, though there was no evidence of any struggle. It was like she had vanished, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The photograph that had been taken just before her disappearance was shared with the public. Experts weighed in, but no one could agree on what the blurred image showed. Some thought it was a trick of the light, while others suggested it was something more sinister. The only thing everyone could agree on was that the image showed a figure in the distance. One that didn't belong there. But who was it? And what was their connection to Sarah? Meanwhile, Sarah's family was torn apart by worry and confusion. They couldn't understand how she could simply vanish like this. Her mother, Sarah's biggest supporter, couldn't stop wondering if there was something she had missed. Something that could have explained why her daughter had gone out that day. Her father, always the skeptic, insisted it was just an accident. She'd gotten lost. She'd probably slipped or fallen, and maybe something had happened to her. But deep down, he didn't believe that. Nothing made sense. Nothing fit. As the investigation dragged on, the authorities began to ask even more difficult questions. Had Sarah been hiding something? What was she really doing out there, alone in the woods? Who could have been watching her? Was someone stalking her in the days before her disappearance? Or had something even darker been lurking out there, in the quiet of the forest? The questions piled up, but answers were hard to find. The search was still ongoing. But it was beginning to feel like a search for something that might not exist anymore. And with every passing day, Sarah's family grew more desperate for answers. Sarah White, the woman who had once wandered the woods with her camera in hand, was now the subject of a mystery, one that might never be solved. The days following Sarah's disappearance were a blur of urgency, uncertainty, and growing dread. The small town, once calm and quiet, had now become a place of constant activity. Sarah's family couldn't fathom what had happened, and the authorities, though doing their best, were beginning to run out of leads. By the time the police arrived at the scene, it was already late in the evening, and the air had cooled considerably. The woods, once a peaceful escape for Sarah, now felt cold, oppressive, and full of unknowns. The first few hours were spent combing the trail, where Sarah had last been seen, but the dense underbrush made it difficult to navigate. Her backpack was the only clue, and it had been found lying open, her camera attached to the strap, everything in place except for Sarah. Her family clung to the hope that she had just gotten lost, maybe taken a wrong turn, or slipped, and hurt herself. But as the sun set and darkness enveloped the forest, that hope began to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing fear that Sarah's disappearance was no accident. By nightfall, the town's residents were beginning to take action. Local volunteers, many of whom knew Sarah from the community, gathered at the trailhead, ready to assist in the search. It wasn't just law enforcement anymore. It was a team of determined people, all working together with one goal: to bring Sarah back. The volunteers were equipped with flashlights and basic supplies, but they had no clear direction. The forest stretched far and wide, its twists and turns making it nearly impossible to predict where Sarah could have gone. The search parties spread out, calling her name, hoping for a sign, any sign. The air was thick with tension. Every shadow felt like a clue. Every rustle in the bushes made everyone stop and listen more intently. Hours passed with little progress. There were no footprints leading away from the trail, no signs of a struggle, no clues about where Sarah could have gone. It was as if she had simply disappeared, swallowed by the woods themselves. Sarah's family, now desperate, stayed close to the search party. They were beside themselves, barely able to keep it together as they moved deeper into the forest. Her mother clung to a thread of hope, refusing to believe that her daughter was truly gone. Her father, more pragmatic, silently assessed the situation, his mind racing for any possible explanation. Had she been abducted? Had she wandered off in a confused state? Or was something even darker at play? The hours turned into a sleepless night, and by morning, exhaustion was beginning to take its toll on everyone involved. But the search couldn't stop. It wouldn't stop. The authorities coordinated their efforts, bringing in more resources. Search dogs were brought in, their noses trained to pick up the faintest trace of Sarah's scent. Helicopters scoured the area from above, hoping to catch sight of any sign that might have been overlooked during the night. But still, nothing. No fresh tracks, no sign of Sarah. Just the haunting emptiness of the forest. The media began to take an interest in the story, and soon, news vans began arriving at the scene. Interviews were conducted with Sarah's family and friends, and the story of the missing photographer quickly spread across social media. The town, once small and quiet, was now overwhelmed with the attention of the outside world. With each passing hour, the question on everyone's lips was the same: where was Sarah? As the search continued into the next day, the community rallied together. More volunteers arrived, eager to help, but each new face only added to the sense of growing unease. What was happening? Why hadn't they found any signs of Sarah yet? Was there something they were missing? It didn't seem possible that someone could just vanish without a trace. Despite all the efforts, there were still no answers. The forest, vast and unyielding, seemed to hold on to its secrets tightly. There were no new clues, no indication of which direction Sarah might have gone. The last person to have seen her was her close friend, Sarah's neighbor, who had spoken with her earlier that morning. She had been fine, just as she always was. No one had seen anything unusual that day. There were no suspicious cars, no unfamiliar faces in the area. Sarah's disappearance was beginning to feel like a riddle with no solution. It was almost as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. The authorities were doing everything they could to keep the search alive, but the hours kept passing without progress. The volunteers had come to help, but their presence felt more like a distraction now than an aid. The search was becoming less about finding Sarah, and more about finding some explanation for why she was gone. And then, just as everyone was beginning to feel the weight of the situation, that this might be a case that would remain unsolved, something new surfaced. A strange, anonymous tip came in. The voice on the other end of the phone was shaking, but the words were clear: "Look closer. There's something in the photo." The police were skeptical at first, but as the person on the other end insisted, they agreed to investigate. The blurry photograph from Sarah's camera, the only physical clue they had, might hold something they hadn't seen before. A team of experts was called in to analyze the photo more closely. It had always been a strange image, distorted and out of focus, but now, with fresh eyes, they noticed something unsettling. In the background of the photo, there appeared to be a shadowy figure, faint but visible, just beyond the trees. The figure didn't resemble Sarah. It was something else, something that hadn't been noticed until now. The image was a clue, but what did it mean? Who was that figure? And could this photograph provide the breakthrough they so desperately needed? The search had entered a new phase now, but the questions were multiplying faster than answers. The forest remained silent, its secrets still locked away, but this photograph, this blurry, eerie image, might be the key to unraveling it all. The search for Sarah White was far from over, but the dark shadow in the photo suggested they might be on the cusp of uncovering something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The photograph from Sarah's camera had always been the single piece of evidence that might hold the answers, but no one could have predicted just how unsettling it would turn out to be. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a blurry, indistinct image, the kind of photo that many photographers might dismiss as a mistake, a result of poor focus, or a shaky hand. But this photo was different. This one held something that the human eye could barely make out, but once identified, it would send a chill through anyone who saw it. Sarah's family had clung to the hope that it was just a picture of a random part of the forest. Nothing more than an unfortunate mistake. But when the photo was analyzed by forensic experts, the mood shifted. The figure in the background of the photo wasn't a misaligned branch or a trick of the light. It wasn't part of the forest at all. The image showed what appeared to be a person standing just beyond the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the blur. And yet, in the chaos of the investigation, it was clear that this figure wasn't supposed to be there. The authorities had already scoured the forest, and there was no sign of anyone else in the area. No footprints had been found, no strangers had been reported near the trail that day. And yet, here was this figure, lurking in the background of Sarah's final photograph. The eerie part was how it seemed to be watching her. The image was so indistinct, so distorted by motion blur, that it was impossible to identify the figure at first. Was it a person? Or was it something else, something more sinister? The investigators were left grappling with one disturbing question. Was this figure the reason Sarah had disappeared? And if so, who were they? No one could answer these questions yet. But everyone involved in the case felt the shift in the air. The photograph had changed everything. It wasn't just a snapshot of the forest anymore. It was the moment something had gone horribly wrong. Sarah had captured something with her camera that was now the key to unlocking her disappearance. But what exactly had she seen? At first, the police didn't know whether to take the photo seriously. After all, it could have been anything, an optical illusion, a trick of the light. But as the days passed, they began to consider the possibility that the figure in the image was real. The blurry outline could have been an accidental capture of someone else who had been in the forest that day. The problem was, no one had seen anyone else. No witnesses had reported anything unusual, no suspicious people had been spotted. It was as though Sarah was alone in that forest, except for the blurry figure in her photo. And that wasn't the only unsettling thing about the image. The more the experts looked at the photograph, the more it seemed as if the figure wasn't merely standing there. The way it was positioned, almost behind the trees, suggested it had been following Sarah, watching her without being noticed. If that was true, it meant someone had been in close proximity to her. The more the authorities looked into this possibility, the more they realized that Sarah's disappearance might not have been an accident after all. This wasn't a simple case of getting lost or suffering an accident on the trail. This was something far more calculated. Someone was involved. For Sarah's family, the discovery of this figure in the photo felt like a knife to the heart. They had always believed that their daughter had simply gotten lost, perhaps injured in the forest, and needed help. But this photograph made it seem like something far more intentional had occurred. Whoever had been in the forest that day wasn't just a random passerby. They had been watching Sarah. The blurred silhouette in the photo might have been the last person to see Sarah before she disappeared. The photo also raised more questions about Sarah's state of mind. What had she seen? Had she known she was being followed? The possibility that she had noticed someone lurking in the woods before she took the picture made the situation even more disturbing. Was she aware of the danger? Had she been trying to capture evidence of it, knowing that something wasn't right? These questions echoed in the minds of everyone involved. The photograph became more than just a piece of evidence. It became a haunting reminder that something sinister was at play. The search for Sarah now took on a new sense of urgency. Authorities knew they had to find out who the person in the photograph was, if they could even identify them. The investigation was no longer just about finding Sarah. It was about finding answers to questions that no one had expected to ask. Who was this figure? What connection did they have to Sarah's disappearance? And, more disturbingly, why had Sarah taken this photograph before she vanished? As the investigation progressed, new leads began to emerge. Some more plausible than others. Police started looking into anyone who might have had a reason to be near the trail that day. even people who had visited the area previously. Could someone have been waiting for Sarah to wander off the beaten path? Could it have been a random act of violence? Or was there something about Sarah's life that had made her a target? Every theory felt like it was a step closer to finding the truth. But it also meant they were deepening into a mystery that could have no simple answers. As the days turned into weeks, the image from Sarah's camera remained the central piece of the puzzle. It was the only clue they had, but it was enough to suggest that Sarah's disappearance was no ordinary case. The shadowy figure in the photo was the last trace anyone had of her, the one thing that might connect the dots. But with every passing day, the mystery only deepened. It was clear now that this wasn't just about finding a missing person. This was a case that could unravel into something far darker than anyone had imagined. And still, Sarah remained missing. The photograph, eerie and blurred, held the only clue. The rest of the world was left waiting, hoping that one day the truth would be revealed. But as each new lead came to a dead end, the question lingered: who was the person in the background of Sarah's last photo? And was the figure more dangerous than anyone had ever realized? The camera Sarah had carried that day had once been a tool of art, a way to capture the fleeting beauty of the world through her eyes. Now, in the hands of the authorities, it had become the centerpiece of the investigation. The blurred figure in Sarah's final photograph was only the beginning. As experts carefully examined the camera, they discovered more than they had anticipated. It was as if the camera itself held secrets that Sarah had never been able to articulate, secrets that, in some strange way, were now the key to understanding her disappearance. Forensic investigators first examined the camera's physical state. It appeared to be in good condition, the lens undamaged, the memory card intact. Everything seemed normal. Yet the very presence of the photo raised questions. The camera had taken that one final image, but was that all it had recorded? Or had there been more? A more detailed examination revealed a strange anomaly. The camera had recorded multiple images in rapid succession, despite Sarah never having mentioned taking so many photos. It wasn't like Sarah to take rapid-fire shots unless something had prompted it. The photos, however, weren't of landscapes or picturesque vistas. They were erratic, fragmented moments. The first few frames appeared to be typical photos of the forest, just as Sarah would have taken. But then, the sequence grew more peculiar. In these later photos, there were strange shifts, subtle yet disturbing. In one, the figure in the background became slightly clearer, though still indistinct. The photos seemed to show Sarah in a state of motion, almost as if she had been moving quickly. Perhaps trying to capture something elusive, something she couldn't quite see. The more the experts studied the sequence, the more it became clear Sarah had been aware of something in the forest. She had been trying to document it, trying to capture it on film. One frame in particular was unsettling. It wasn't as blurred as the others, and it showed a faint shadow of something in the trees, a silhouette, similar to the first figure, but this time it was closer. It wasn't a distant, indistinct shape. It was nearly in focus. A dark figure that could be seen just beyond the trees. The photo was out of focus in a way that suggested the figure might have been moving quickly. And Sarah had snapped the shot in the instant, before it disappeared behind a cluster of trees. Why had she taken these photos? Was she being chased? Or was she trying to capture a moment that was too horrifying to comprehend? The photos didn't give all the answers, but they raised a chilling possibility. Sarah had been followed, maybe even stalked, for much of her hike. The shadowy figure in the background wasn't just an accidental blur. It was someone, or something, that had been with her in the woods. The revelation of these photos cast a dark shadow over the investigation. Sarah's actions were now seen in an entirely different light. She hadn't simply been a victim of bad luck. She had been pursued, perhaps from the moment she stepped onto the trail. And what made it worse was that no one had realized. The authorities, the search parties, the family, no one had known that Sarah was in danger. She had been alone with whatever this thing was. Her last photos were not just images of nature, they were silent cries for help. Left behind in the hopes that someone would see them before it was too late. The investigation took an unexpected turn as police began to reconsider everything. They thought they knew about Sarah's disappearance. Had she been aware of a threat, even before she left for the hike? Was there something in her past that could explain why she had been followed into the woods? Could this figure have been someone who had been watching her for a long time? Or had it been a random encounter? At this point, the authorities were no longer simply looking for a missing person. They were looking for a predator. But the more they dug, the more confused they became. Sarah had been a solitary person by nature, yes, but she had no history of being stalked or harassed. Her friends and family could not recall any signs that she had been afraid or felt threatened by someone. Yet, these photos, taken just moments before her disappearance, suggested that she had been aware of someone, and that person had been following her. The question of who this figure was became the central focus of the investigation. The authorities took the photographs and began scouring the area once more, hoping to find any trace of the figure, any clue that could point to their identity. They spoke to anyone who had been in the area that day, looking for anything that might connect them to the image. But so far, no one had come forward with any useful information. Sarah's family, meanwhile, was left to grapple with the terrible reality of what the camera had revealed. For them, it was an agonizing confirmation that their daughter hadn't simply disappeared. She had been pursued, watched, perhaps even hunted. Her mother, in particular, couldn't bear the thought of Sarah being alone, frightened, and unaware of the danger that had been lurking just behind her. The photos had revealed a truth that no one was ready to accept. But now, there was no denying it. Something sinister had happened in those woods. The search continued. But the discovery of the photos brought a deeper sense of urgency to the investigation. It was no longer just about finding Sarah. It was about finding the person who had been watching her, following her, and who might have been responsible for her disappearance. The photos had shifted the investigation into a new, darker direction. The authorities now had a clear objective. They needed to find the person in the photograph before they could cause any more harm. But the chilling reality was setting in. Whoever was in those photos wasn't just a shadow. They were real, and they were still out there, somewhere. As the search intensified, more questions arose. What had Sarah seen before she disappeared? What had she known? And what did the camera know about the person who had been following her? The answers were out there, hidden among the trees, in the shadows of the forest, and in the final moments of Sarah White's life. The camera had captured them, and now it was up to the authorities to uncover the rest of the story. As the investigation into Sarah's disappearance progressed, the evidence seemed to complicate the situation more than clarify it. The camera, once an innocuous tool for capturing nature's beauty, had become a source of chilling revelation. The blurry figure in the photo, the odd sequence of shots, and the apparent signs of someone following Sarah suggested that she hadn't simply gotten lost or wandered off the path. Something far more sinister had occurred. But what exactly? At first, the authorities had followed the assumption that Sarah might have simply gotten lost. After all, she had ventured out alone, and even though she was an experienced hiker, anyone could become disoriented, especially in a vast forest. The dense woods, unfamiliar to anyone not intimately familiar with the terrain, could easily lead someone astray. Yet, as the search dragged on and the clues mounted, it became increasingly unlikely that this was the simple cause of her disappearance. She had been too experienced, and the trail was well marked. Getting lost seemed an improbable explanation for a disappearance of this magnitude. The photograph had changed everything. It suggested that someone had been with Sarah in those final moments, someone who had been lurking, waiting, and following her through the forest. No longer could the authorities ignore the possibility of foul play. The blurred figure in the photo wasn't just an accidental shot. It was the image of someone Sarah had clearly been aware of. Someone who had been in the forest with her, possibly stalking her. This discovery led the authorities to consider a darker theory, an abduction. The possibility that Sarah had been taken, forcibly removed from the trail, grew more plausible by the day. Could someone have been waiting for her to be alone, to wander off the beaten path, where they could take advantage of the opportunity? The blurry photo seemed to suggest this. The figure was too close to be a mere passerby, and the fact that Sarah had taken so many quick, hurried photos, likely trying to capture evidence of something she felt she couldn't explain, spoke volumes. But if she had been abducted, where was she now? No ransom note had appeared, and no demands had been made. Her family, desperate for answers, couldn't understand why she hadn't been found, or why there were no clear signs of the abductor. Another theory that began to surface was that Sarah had been chasing a story, though this seemed less likely. Could she have been documenting something she thought was important? Something that she had stumbled upon during her hike. There was no clear reason for her to be in any danger. And yet the photo seemed to show a figure moving with intent. What if Sarah had unknowingly gotten too close to something, and this person, whoever they were, had felt the need to silence her? This theory was speculative, but it wasn't impossible. Sarah had been an amateur photographer, and it wasn't outside the realm of possibility that she had stumbled upon something significant, something that made her a target. As the investigation deepened, another angle was explored. The idea that Sarah might have been running from something, whether a person or some unseen threat. The more the authorities analyzed her life, the more it became clear that Sarah had been a solitary person by nature, someone who kept to herself. But she had no history of enemies, no known personal issues that could suggest why someone would want to harm her. It didn't add up. The idea that she had been running from a threat, whether real or imagined, began to make the most sense. However, one theory that no one could dismiss was the possibility of a random act of violence. There had been no evidence of premeditation, no signs that Sarah had been targeted. It could have been that someone with ill intentions had crossed her path by chance, someone who had seen her as an opportunity. The randomness of it made it terrifying, because if this were true, then Sarah wasn't just a victim of a calculated crime, she was a victim of pure bad luck. This theory was the most disheartening, as it meant that Sarah could have been taken for reasons no one could predict or understand. But perhaps the most unsettling theory, the one that sent shivers down the spines of the investigators and Sarah's family alike, was the idea that Sarah had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone realized. A theory began to emerge that Sarah, in her love for the outdoors, had unknowingly wandered into an area where illicit activities took place. Perhaps the figure in the photograph wasn't an innocent passerby at all. What if Sarah had inadvertently discovered something, a person, a group, or something else, that had turned deadly? The idea that she could have been unknowingly swept into a dangerous situation terrified everyone. Was Sarah's photography just a cover for a much deeper mystery? With each new theory, the investigation seemed to spiral into more questions, not fewer. The police couldn't rule anything out, and the more they searched for answers, the more they found themselves stumbling into dead ends. Sarah's family was growing increasingly frustrated. They were desperate for closure, but the uncertainty was taking its toll. Every theory, Every possibility seemed plausible, but nothing connected the dots in a way that could lead to answers. And then, there was the photograph. The blurred figure was now at the heart of every theory, but no one knew who the person was, or why they had been there. Theories about Sarah's abduction, her possible involvement in something dangerous, and the random nature of the crime were all grounded in this single, haunting image. The more the authorities studied it, the more they realized just how little they truly knew. The search continued, but the questions only grew. Had Sarah been the victim of a stalker? Had she been running from someone? Or had she stumbled upon something far darker than anyone realized? No theory could explain the disappearance with complete certainty, and as each day passed, the pressure mounted to find an answer. Whoever was responsible for Sarah's disappearance, they were still out there, and they knew something no one else did. Theories, in the end, were just that, theories. What Sarah had been through before she vanished was still unclear. But with every passing day, one thing became certain: the truth, whatever it was buried deep beneath the layers of confusion, lies, and unanswered questions. And someone knew it. The investigation into Sarah White's disappearance was no longer a search for a missing person. It had evolved into a tangled web of theories, possibilities, and unsettling truths. The authorities, now more determined than ever, began to sift through every piece of information with renewed urgency. What had started as a simple case of a hiker gone missing was quickly turning into something far more complex and possibly dangerous. Theories about abduction, danger in the woods, and even illicit activity in the area began to merge into one chilling possibility: that Sarah had stumbled upon something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. The first breakthrough in the case came from an unlikely source: a series of old, forgotten records. As the police scoured local archives, they discovered a series of similar disappearances dating back to the last few years. The cases had all involved hikers or nature enthusiasts who had gone missing without a trace, and each one had been inexplicably linked to areas close to the one Sarah had visited. While these previous cases had never been connected, the discovery of their similarity sent a shiver down the spine of the investigators. Were these earlier disappearances connected to Sarah's? The link between these cases was thin but undeniable. Each missing person had been found to have been in the same general vicinity before vanishing. The woods near Sarah's trail had been the setting for multiple disappearances, and the more the investigators dug into these cases, the more connections began to surface. Was it possible that someone had been targeting people in these forests all along? Had they been waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The authorities began to focus on a key question. Was Sarah's disappearance the result of a single predator? Someone who had been lurking in the forest, waiting for someone like her? Or had the entire sequence of disappearances been caused by a larger, more organized force? As they revisited the cases, they uncovered a disturbing detail: each of the victims, before vanishing, had reported feeling watched. Were these isolated events? Or was there something much bigger at play? As these connections were made, another surprising detail came to light. Sarah had not been the only one to feel the presence of someone in the woods that day. Sarah's best friend, Emma, who had been desperately trying to make sense of her disappearance, revealed something crucial. After Sarah went missing, Emma began to dig into her friend's life and came across a journal Sarah had kept. In it, Sarah had written about feeling watched during her hikes in recent weeks, even before the day she disappeared. Emma found one entry in particular that sent chills through her. "I feel like someone is following me, and I'm not sure how to escape." This revelation hit like a punch to the gut. For weeks before her disappearance, Sarah had sensed something was wrong, that she was being watched. But why hadn't anyone noticed? How could they have missed the signs? Emma shared the journal with the authorities, and it was clear that this entry was the key to understanding Sarah's mindset. She hadn't just gone into the woods to take pictures. She had gone into the woods, unknowingly walking into a dangerous situation. The police, now focusing on the possibility that Sarah had been stalked by someone before her disappearance, dug deeper into her past. Had she had any interactions with strangers that could explain the sense of being followed? Had she come into contact with anyone who could have caused her harm? Emma remembered something Sarah had mentioned just before her last hike, a man she had met while attending a photography event months earlier. She'd talked about him with a mixture of unease and curiosity. The man was older, a photographer as well, and had taken an unusual interest in Sarah's work. According to Emma, Sarah had seemed uncomfortable around him, but had brushed it off, saying he was just a bit too eager to talk about photography. The investigators, now with a lead, began to trace the man's movements. They discovered that he had been at the event Sarah attended, and had also been near the trail, where she disappeared on the day she went missing. But there was no clear evidence connecting him to Sarah's disappearance, just an unsettling coincidence. Still, his presence near the area was enough to warrant further investigation. A breakthrough came when surveillance footage from a nearby town was examined. A camera, positioned outside a gas station, had captured an image of the man, not far from where Sarah had been hiking. The footage showed him entering the gas station the morning Sarah disappeared. His behavior was erratic, almost too eager to avoid the camera, which only raised more suspicions. Had he seen something in Sarah's final photo? Was he somehow involved in her vanishing? But as the investigation delved into this new lead, another twist emerged. The man had an alibi. He had been at his home, hundreds of miles away, when Sarah went missing. His presence on the footage was a result of a trip he had made earlier in the day, but his phone records confirmed that he had been far away when Sarah disappeared. The alibi seemed solid, and with that, the police were left wondering if they had been on the wrong trail entirely. Was it a coincidence, or was someone else involved? The case was becoming even more complicated. Each lead, no matter how promising, only seemed to unravel further mysteries. It was clear that Sarah's disappearance wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger puzzle, one that no one had yet figured out. The more they uncovered, the more questions emerged, and every answer led to even darker possibilities. Sarah's last moments, captured in the images from her camera, held the key, but those moments only raised more chilling questions. The investigation began to feel like an endless loop of dead ends. Was the person in the photograph just a random hiker who had crossed paths with Sarah? Was the person who had been stalking her someone from her past? Or was the answer far more complicated than anyone had imagined? The authorities, now deep in the heart of a labyrinth of possibilities, began to wonder. Was Sarah's disappearance the result of a single person or a larger network? Was she an unfortunate victim of a serial predator? Or had she simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time? As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the truth about Sarah's disappearance was buried somewhere in the darkness of the forest. And no one knew how much more darkness they would have to uncover before the truth was finally revealed. The only thing certain was that Sarah's story was far from over, and the truth was hiding just beneath the surface. As the investigation into Sarah White's disappearance grew more complex, the authorities began to dig into her past, hoping to uncover any clues that might explain why she had been targeted. Until then, they had focused primarily on the circumstances surrounding the hike, the strange photo, the blurred figure, the feeling of being watched. But now, the police were beginning to realize that Sarah's disappearance might be connected to something much darker, something hidden deep within her life. Was it possible that there was more to Sarah's story than anyone had known. The first breakthrough came when the police examined Sarah's online presence and personal journals. Sarah had always kept her photography and her private life separate, but as they sifted through her social media and old posts, they began to uncover things she had kept hidden. She had been active online, sharing her photography and sometimes discussing her personal experiences, but there were gaps, periods where she had gone silent, even though she had been active in the past. The authorities began to wonder why she had been so secretive during those times. As they examined her social media more closely, they noticed something strange. Sarah had become increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to her disappearance. She had stopped posting photos of her personal life, focusing solely on nature and her photography. But in a few private messages she had exchanged with friends, Sarah had dropped cryptic hints about feeling overwhelmed by something, a sense that someone was watching her, or worse, that she was being followed. There was one message in particular that stood out. It was sent just a few weeks before her disappearance to a close friend, a fellow photographer named Kate. The message was brief but chilling. "I think I'm being watched. It's hard to explain. Maybe it's nothing, but it feels wrong. I'm trying to shake it off, but it's there." Kate, concerned, had tried to reassure Sarah, but the cryptic message was enough to make her feel uneasy. At the time, Kate had brushed it off, thinking Sarah was just stressed out or being paranoid. But now, looking back, the words seemed ominous. Had Sarah known something was coming? Had she sensed the danger before it struck? The police began to wonder if Sarah had been hiding something darker in her life, something she had never shared with anyone. They decided to dig deeper, looking into her previous relationships and any interactions she might have had with people who could have posed a threat. The more they searched, the more they began to uncover a network of people who had been around Sarah, people who were far from innocent. One name stood out among them: Jonas Blake, a man who had worked with Sarah on a few photography projects a year before her disappearance. He was an eccentric photographer, known for his odd behavior and intense obsession with nature. He had been in contact with Sarah for several months, but after an argument over a photo shoot, the two had stopped speaking. According to Sarah's friends, Jonas had been upset when Sarah decided to move forward with her career without his involvement. The police found it strange that, after their fallout, Jonas had continued to follow Sarah's work from a distance. He had even posted strange, borderline obsessive comments on her photos. When the police investigated Jonas further, they uncovered something disturbing. He had a history of stalking. Years ago, he had been involved in a harassment case, though the charges had never been formally filed. His obsessive behavior had been dismissed as eccentricity at the time. But now, with Sarah's disappearance, it seemed like a glaring red flag. Had Jonas become fixated on Sarah, his former collaborator? Had his obsession escalated to the point where he felt he could not let her go? The authorities decided to look more closely at his movements around the time Sarah disappeared. They discovered that Jonas had been in the area the day she went missing. He had posted a photo of the same forest on his social media, but it wasn't clear whether he had been near the exact trail where Sarah had hiked. Still, his presence in the area raised questions. Did he have an alibi for that day? And if so, why was he so keen on posting photos of the exact place Sarah had disappeared? The investigation into Jonas's past revealed a chilling fact. He had a history of obsession with his subjects. His past relationships with other women had ended poorly, with several of them accusing him of stalking. But nothing had ever stuck legally, and he had always been able to talk his way out of any serious consequences. In fact, he had a reputation for charming his way out of tight situations, leaving everyone to wonder if he had done the same with Sarah. Could he have convinced her to go on a hike with him? Had he manipulated her into trusting him, only to later become consumed with his possessive desires? The more the police dug into Sarah's past, the more they realized she had been hiding parts of her life that were far from peaceful. She had been trying to carve out a future for herself, to become a successful photographer, but there were forces around her that had been weighing her down. Sarah had been grappling with more than just the pressures of her work. She had been running from something, or someone. The deeper the authorities dug, the clearer it became that Sarah's disappearance was tied to a combination of personal demons, obsessive behavior, and a hidden network of relationships that no one had known about. Jonas Blake's involvement in her life was more significant than anyone had imagined, and his possible connection to her vanishing began to feel more and more likely. Could he have been the one to follow Sarah that day, watching her from the shadows, just as she had feared? Had he been the one in the blurred photograph, the shadowy figure that had sent a wave of panic through the investigation? But there was still one question that lingered, unanswered. If Jonas had been involved, why hadn't he been caught? He was elusive, manipulative, and carefully hidden behind his charm. Had he been able to evade suspicion all this time? Was he, too, part of something larger? Something even more disturbing than just his obsession with Sarah. Sarah White had been a woman with a love for photography and the quiet beauty of the world around her. But her life had also been marked by secrets, by people who had crossed boundaries, and by the shadows of those who would stop at nothing to possess what they could never truly have. As the authorities unraveled these hidden layers of Sarah's past, the true danger of what had happened to her began to surface, and it was darker than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation into Sarah White's disappearance grew more intense, the list of potential suspects began to expand. What had initially seemed like a tragic and unexplained vanishing now appeared to be the result of a complex and deeply troubling web of interactions. Each suspect brought with them a new theory, new suspicions, and, ultimately, more unanswered questions. The authorities had to sift through a list of people who might have had a motive to harm Sarah, but, with so many possible connections, the truth seemed to become more elusive with every passing day. At the top of the suspect list was Jonas Blake, the photographer who had once worked with Sarah on a few projects. His obsessive behavior, his history of problematic relationships, and his presence near the trail the day Sarah disappeared made him a prime suspect. But the authorities couldn't ignore the fact that Jonas had an alibi, one that seemed airtight. He had been in a different town at the time of Sarah's disappearance. But the alibi raised even more troubling questions. Why had Jonas lied about his whereabouts? What had he been doing in the area that day? And why had he taken such pains to cover his tracks? Even if he wasn't directly responsible for Sarah's disappearance, the possibility that he had been involved in some way could not be ruled out. The more the investigators dug into Jonas's background, the more they discovered just how deep his obsession with Sarah might have gone. He had known Sarah to be ambitious, driven, and fiercely independent, traits that might have driven someone like Jonas to see her as a prize to be won or controlled. The line between admiration and obsession was thin, and in Jonas's case, it was clear he had crossed it. Jonas's fascination with Sarah's photography had started innocently enough, but it had quickly evolved into something darker. He had taken credit for many of their joint works, even subtly undermining Sarah's contributions, to the point where Sarah had distanced herself from him. This sense of entitlement seemed to be a recurring theme in Jonas's past relationships, both personal and professional. And as Sarah's career began to take off, Jonas's bitterness grew. Had Sarah become the target of his anger, his jealousy, or his desire to possess her? But Jonas was not the only person under suspicion. Emma, Sarah's close friend and fellow photographer, also became a person of interest. Emma had always been supportive of Sarah. But could there have been more to their friendship than met the eye? The police uncovered a hidden layer of Emma's life, one that suggested her feelings for Sarah had possibly crossed into obsession. Emma had always been somewhat possessive of Sarah, perhaps in a way that Sarah had never fully acknowledged. Had Emma become jealous of Sarah's growing success? Had she seen Sarah's ambition as a threat, one that would take Sarah away from her? Emma had been the last person to speak with Sarah before her hike. Could she have been involved in Sarah's disappearance? Either knowingly or unknowingly. The police weren't sure, but they couldn't rule out the possibility. Emma had been so wrapped up in the search for Sarah that she hadn't noticed how some of her own behavior could have been seen as unusual. Had Emma been trying to protect Sarah from something? Or had she been trying to control her in ways that no one had realized? Then there was Sarah's family, whose relationships with her were less than perfect. Sarah had been close to her mother, but her father had always been distant, emotionally unavailable. The authorities began to consider the possibility that there had been underlying family issues that could have played a role in Sarah's disappearance. Her father's aloofness had always created a rift between them. But could there have been something more sinister at play? Had Sarah's father, in a moment of frustration or anger, become involved in something that led to her disappearance? It seemed unlikely, but no stone could be left unturned. The police also turned their attention to Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Daniel, who had been distant for months before Sarah went missing. Their breakup had been relatively amicable, but as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there had been unresolved tension between them. Daniel had always been protective of Sarah. But could his protectiveness have crossed into possessiveness? Had their past relationship been marked by jealousy, control, or unresolved feelings? There were signs of emotional manipulation that seemed to point to a darker side of their relationship, and Sarah's decision to break up with him might have sparked a dangerous reaction. Had Daniel, knowing how vulnerable Sarah had been, taken matters into his own hands? As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to realize that everyone connected to Sarah had some potential motive. Her ex-boyfriend might have wanted closure, but he could have also wanted to stop her from moving forward without him. Jonas might have seen Sarah as someone to possess, as a prize that he couldn't let go of. Emma, while deeply loyal, might have had a darker side that Sarah had never fully recognized. And Sarah's father, while seemingly distant, could have been hiding feelings of resentment that had been building for years. In a world full of relationships marked by unspoken jealousy, hidden feelings, and the pressure of ambition, the list of suspects seemed to grow by the day. But still, no one had a clear motive. No one had come forward with a confession. Everyone had their own reasons for being involved in Sarah's life, but none of those reasons seemed to fully explain why she had disappeared. The figure in the photograph, the blurry shadow in the woods, had not yet been identified. The authorities began to ask themselves, was it possible that the person who had been following Sarah was someone none of them had suspected? Someone completely outside of her circle. Someone who had been hiding in the shadows all along. The case continued to spiral into uncertainty. Every lead seemed to bring more questions than answers, and every suspect seemed to have their own hidden motives. But the truth, buried beneath layers of lies, jealousy, and obsession, was still elusive. Who had the strongest reason to harm Sarah? Was the person who had taken her someone close to her, someone she knew and trusted? Or was the real danger someone lurking on the edges of her life? Someone who had been watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to strike? The authorities had their suspicions, but the truth was still out there, somewhere, hidden in the dark corners of Sarah's life. The investigation into Sarah White's disappearance had consumed the town, the authorities, and, most painfully, her family. For weeks there had been nothing but dead ends, false leads, and a growing sense of despair. The photographs, the blurred figure, the secrets buried in Sarah's past, all of it had only led to more confusion. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the search became more focused, the truth finally began to emerge from the shadows. It was a seemingly minor piece of evidence, something that had been overlooked early in the investigation, that ultimately cracked the case open. During a routine review of local security footage, a security camera positioned near the entrance to a secluded trailhead, a path Sarah had often taken, captured something that had been missed by everyone else. The footage showed a car pulling up to the trailhead the morning Sarah disappeared. The driver was wearing a hooded jacket, their face obscured. But the vehicle was recognizable, an old van that had been reported near the forest weeks earlier by another hiker. The investigators took the image to Sarah's family, hoping to get some sort of lead. Sarah's mother, staring at the image for a long moment, suddenly gasped. "That's Jonas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Jonas Blake, the photographer she worked with." The realization hit hard. Jonas, whose obsession had been brushed aside as harmless eccentricity, was the one who had been lurking in the background of Sarah's life. But why hadn't anyone connected the dots sooner? The car, the van, the strange behaviors, they were all pieces of the puzzle that had been sitting in plain sight. The authorities quickly tracked Jonas down. He was living in a rundown house on the outskirts of town, a place that barely qualified as a home. When the police arrived, Jonas didn't resist. He didn't need to. The evidence against him was overwhelming. But what shocked the investigators most was the calmness with which he accepted his fate. Jonas confessed quickly, almost eagerly, as though he had been waiting for the moment when the truth would come out. But the story he told wasn't what anyone had expected. He revealed that he had indeed been stalking Sarah, but not in the way anyone had thought. Jonas hadn't planned to harm her directly. Instead, he had wanted to reassert control over her life. Over the course of their brief collaboration, he had grown possessive, unable to accept the idea of Sarah moving forward without him. He had seen her success as a betrayal, a rejection of their shared dreams. Sarah, the ambitious photographer, had begun to outshine him, and Jonas couldn't handle the idea of her leaving him behind. He had seen her growing popularity as an affront to his own self-image, and he had begun following her, watching her from afar, trying to figure out how to regain the hold he once had on her. The morning Sarah disappeared, Jonas had gone to the trail, waiting for the right moment to confront her. When he saw her walking alone, his emotions surged. He had tried to call out to her, to convince her to return to their earlier collaboration. But Sarah had turned away. She had been frightened by the sudden appearance of someone she thought she had left behind. Jonas, feeling the sting of rejection, had followed her into the woods, watching from the distance, the figure captured in the blurred photograph. Jonas confessed that he had approached Sarah, attempting to force her to listen to him. But when she refused, when she rejected his presence, he lost control. It wasn't physical violence he sought, but emotional destruction, to make her see that she was not the success she thought she was. When she tried to escape from him, Jonas panicked. In his twisted mind, she was slipping away from him, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. The details of what happened next remained a blur, but Jonas claimed that he had never intended for it to go as far as it did. But when Sarah had tried to run from him, she stumbled and fell, hitting her head. She had been knocked unconscious, and when Jonas realized the severity of the situation, fear took over. He had hidden her body, hoping that by the time anyone found her, they would just think she had gone missing on her own. But the truth was more horrifying. Sarah's death had been an accident, But Jonas's actions, his obsession, his need for control, had led directly to her tragic end. The authorities had searched for weeks, but Jonas had watched them from afar. Knowing they were getting closer, he had thought he could escape the consequences of his actions, but in the end, he couldn't. When Jonas was arrested, it became clear that Sarah's disappearance was not just a random act. It was the tragic result of obsession and control gone too far. Sarah, a woman with ambition and a love for the world around her, had been caught in a web of manipulation she hadn't fully understood. In the end, it wasn't just the forest that had swallowed her. It was the darkness in the hearts of those closest to her. The news of Jonas's confession spread quickly, and the town, which had been shaken to its core, slowly began to heal. Sarah's family, though devastated by the loss, finally found some measure of peace knowing the truth. Her photographs, once a symbol of her love for nature, now stood as a testament to her vision, one that had been tragically cut short. But Sarah's story, her legacy, would not be forgotten. As for Jonas, his quiet confession revealed more about his character than anything else. He hadn't been a man with a plan or a clear motive. He had been driven by an insatiable need for control, a fear of being left behind, and a destructive obsession that ended in tragedy. The forest, once a place of beauty and tranquility for Sarah, would never be the same. But in the end, the truth had come to light. Sarah had been a victim of her own success, her own ambitions, and the darkness that had followed her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And though the truth had been painful to uncover, it had brought justice for Sarah, giving her family and friends the closure they so desperately needed. The case was closed, but Sarah White's story would live on forever. A reminder of the dangers of obsession, the complexities of human relationships, and the fragile line between love and control. Sarah White's tragic disappearance was not just an accident, but the result of a dangerous obsession. Hidden beneath the surface of those closest to her, Jonas Blake, driven by jealousy and control, had stalked and manipulated Sarah until his actions led to her untimely death. His confession brought a painful truth to light, giving her family the closure they desperately needed. Though Sarah's life was cut short, her legacy lives on through her photography and the lessons learned from her story. The investigation may have ended, but the impact of her life, and the darkness that can exist in the hearts of those we trust, will never be forgotten. If Sarah's story resonated with you, it's a reminder of how deeply hidden truths can shape the world around us. As we dive deeper into the complexities of human nature, let's keep exploring the mysteries, the untold stories, and the lessons that come with them. Stay curious, stay engaged, and let's continue unraveling the truths together. Because sometimes, the real story is just beginning.